It is about that time. Despite no meaningful games on the calendar for another month plus, but we love it, and the anticipation is awesome. We are in progress for training camps across the league now, which means the talking heads and ESPN and the like will be filling the rest of the summer air with meaningless nonsense from those training camps. But one thing I am really excited to see, and something I do not think we've heard much about up to this point, at least in terms of media coverage, are the new kickoff rules. I think this has the potential to change not only the strategy for the kickoff plays themselves, but I see this as having a direct impact on game day active rosters. Most people are aware of the 53-man roster, but the actual number of players available on game day is 46. And while most people are focused on the big names and fantasy and the individual player props, I really see this new play as having an impact on what that 46-man looks like. And I mean that in terms of the impact on the game overall, not just the kickoff or kickoff return plays. Think about it. We have been on autopilot for a long time now, where we assume we're either going to get a kickoff that flies through the back of the end zone or deep enough into the end zone where there is no return attempted. Now, also remember, the fair catch rule has factored in more recently as well, where ultimately you are talking only 1 in 5 kickoffs being returned coming out of the 2023 season. And last season, the UFL, XFL, whatever we're calling it, had a 97% kickoff return rate. 97%. So for the sake of conversation, let's extrapolate that out over a normal NFL game, where between start of game, halftime, all the scoring plays, you're looking at about 10 to 12 kickoff plays. Well, given that near 100% return rate I just mentioned, you're talking about, and this is speaking conservatively, 8 to 10 total kickoff returns. This is absolutely going to factor into the game. And I can promise you it matters to coaches, and this play is being schemed for and will have an impact on roster cutdowns coming out of training camp. Let's start with the play itself. The ball will still be kicked from the 35-yard line, but the 10 kickoff coverage guys will be lined up on the other side of midfield, along the receiving team's 40-yard line. The kickoff return team will be required to have, at minimum, 9 players in what they're calling the setup zone, which is between their own 30 to 35-yard line. Now, there are some other nuances as far as alignment for the return team, but we're not going to get into that today. So moving on, the landing zone is between the goal line and the 20-yard line. The touchback on either a kick through the end zone or a player on the receiving team taking a knee on a kick they catch in the end zone, that will start the offensive possession at the 30-yard line, which is 5 yards ahead of where it has been on existing touchbacks. Now, 5 yards might not sound like a lot, but I can guarantee if you asked the 64 head coaches and defensive coordinators around the league, hey, where would you rather have the opponent start their possession? The 30-yard line or the 25-yard line? Or anywhere in between the goal line and the 30, they will choose the lesser field position 100 times out of 100 times. That being said, I am fully anticipating that we will see all kinds of strategies for pinning teams deep. Whether it's directional kicking or trying to get a massive amount of air under the kick to get the coverage team down there, I really do not expect we are going to see teams just having the kicker bang the ball through the end zone. Think about a team playing against the Kansas City Chiefs. If you have the opportunity to have Patrick Mahomes and company start at the 18-yard line or the 23-yard line or the 30-yard line on a touchback, you're not spotting them the 30-yard line on the touchback. You are going to take your chances on the return that you will keep the possession starting as close to their goal line as possible. Now, I think the strategy and the angling to gain an advantage will play out on the return side as well. We are decades removed from top offensive talents returning kickoffs. I would say the days of seeing top tier offensive weapons involved in special teams faded out, about 10 years ago, where you might occasionally see an offensive starter put in spot duty on a punt return in a late game situation, but that has been non existent in the modern day NFL. With this new format on the kickoff play, I believe we will see a lot more key offensive and defensive starters involved. And depending how old you are, you might remember, Brian Dawkins, Hall of Fame safety, played the majority of his career with the Philadelphia Eagles, and then concluded his career with the Broncos. Dawkins was famous for playing on special teams units, despite his status as a perennial Pro Bowl player. I mean, for context, this guy was a first team All-Pro 4 times. His want to was simply a result of who the guy was. He was a football player in every sense of the term. And generally speaking, whether you're talking high school, college, or the NFL, if you are an impact starter on offense or defense, you do not play on the special teams units. Dawkins relished the opportunity. And the reason I cite Dawkins as an example is I do believe you will see changes to the personnel on these kickoff coverage and kickoff return units. And that is exactly why I expect more recognizable names involved in this kickoff play. Remember week 1 Monday Night Football last year? Xavier Gipson took that punt return to the house to defeat the Bills in overtime. He was a guy who was on the cut line bubble in training camp, which we got to see on Hard Knocks prior to the season. I think there are going to be a lot more players within the Xavier Gipson skill set that may end up making the 53-man more routinely now that there is an extra importance placed on the new kickoff play. Generally speaking, most teams carry 5 to 6 wide receivers and corners into a game week. Now that may not sound like a lot of players allocated to those 2 positions, but given where we are with regard to passing and defending the pass, I think it tracks. So that creates a scenario where the value of a given player or players on a week-to-week basis factors into what that particular position group brings into a given week. Most people are not aware of this, but you're generally looking at active or inactive decisions based on or impacted by depth at wide receiver and defensive back, or offensive lineman, defensive lineman. Those are the positions where the rotations really come into play. Because throughout the course of a game, you will see guys on the field that extend well beyond the starters in that position group. So if you have, let's say, an offensive tackle on your practice squad that is deficient in a certain area. For example, let's say he's not the best pass pro guy, maybe he misses some reads, and the rating on that player is, we cannot have him as next up in the event that one of our starting tackles goes down. Well, if that player happens to be a plus athlete and is just a solid football player who will throw his body around, maybe he's now considered in the 46-man active on game day. He can block for you on kickoffs, play on the field goal or extra point team, and otherwise have an impact where he would not previously be considered to contribute. I would apply the same logic to the wide receiver 5s and 6s, or cornerback 5s and 6s. Most of those guys were among the skill player stars of their college teams, and at one point or another probably returned kickoffs and punts. They may have even been all-conference special teams players. But once you get to the league, and because of the limitations on game day rosters, if you can't contribute in a meaningful way on offense or defense, it's unlikely the team is allocating a roster spot on game day. And while there are notable exceptions, I'm thinking, Don Beebe, Steve Tasker, Steve Gleason, Matt Slater, those guys are extremely rare. It is nearly impossible to carve out a decade-plus career in the NFL at a skill position where special teams is your sole contribution. I'll use a baseball analogy. As a non-pitcher or catcher, you have virtually zero chance at making the big leagues if you cannot provide offensive value, specifically hitting. You could be the best athlete, make every defensive play just an automatic out if the ball gets hit your way. But if you hit below the Mendoza, you're not getting called up. Clubs don't care if you vacuum up every ball or don't let anything land in your part of the outfield. If you are not competent at the plate, you are not going to be on the major league roster. Now, the reason I bring that up is it's a new day with this rule change on the kickoff, and a player's impact on the game can be drastically amplified if they provide value on either the return or coverage teams, or maybe both. Think about the guys who, if they even get onto the active game day roster, play 8 to 10 snaps per game, maybe in the dime package on defense. If that same player happens to have some elite skills with the ball in his hands, he may very well become an automatic active because of what he can provide on special teams. And that's what I'm talking about when I brought up overall roster construct. If a team believes a player can provide plus value as a returner, that impacts decisions elsewhere. That could be the difference between having 4 defensive tackles available or 3 defensive tackles, which then has a domino effect on the defensive calls. If you're a defensive coordinator who runs a 3-4 base defense and is counting on 12 to 15 snaps from the relief or rotational guys, he may only have 1 rotational guy available. And then you factor in potential injuries, things start to get real interesting. I also see potential impact to the defensive game plan in terms of depth at various positions. Depending on the opponent in any given week, you may have to scheme for a player or players that ultimately require depth at a certain position group. Imagine you are playing against the Bills. We know they like to throw it all over the place with the quarterback. A quarterback, I would add, who can also run past most of your defensive players and run over or run through your defensive backs. Not to mention a running game we saw really come online late last season with James Cook. Well, maybe the personnel packages that week are skewed towards having an extra outside linebacker out there. But what if the guy playing that role goes down during the game? Do you have a similar player you can plug in? Or is the extra running back, wide receiver, cornerback, who is now active that week, taking up a spot that may otherwise be used to carry that depth at outside linebacker? Well, now you have to change up your defensive strategy. And that, in turn, affects your personnel packages, your defensive formations, the pre-snap movement, all of it. So you can see how everything is interconnected. Every roster move can have an impact on a game, even if it goes largely unnoticed by the public. More to come on this subject. I just think it's somewhat odd that we are now in training camp, and what is arguably the biggest rule change in terms of on-field play, now that the playoff overtime rules, they're a big deal as well, but we saw that, in last year's Super Bowl. But this kickoff play just doesn't seem to be talked about proportionately, relative to what its overall impact is going to be. Appreciate everyone listening.